My name is Tobin Freed. I am the Sustainability Manager for the City of Durham and Durham County, and I'm here representing local governments, which include cities and counties. So, like everybody else, I have to disclaim that this is representative of our thoughts, but not vetted through elected officials or city managers or any of that kind of stuff. So you know the drill by now. Everybody's in the same boat. So we discussed it here at our last meeting, and then we took the questions that were asked and some of our thoughts back to a larger group of representatives of local governments. This included, there's a Southeast Sustainability Directors Network, which is a network of people who in local government doing sustainability. And we have a North Carolina kind of subgroup of that. So we discussed it with folks on that group, and we left them opportunities to email and provide a lot of good feedback that way. And then a lot of us have been participating in the Environmental Defense Fund Cities Initiative, and so we'd already been talking about this for 8 months or however long that's been, and so we drew heavily on that as well. All right, our 3 priority goals for participating in the Clean Energy Plan. Defining and removing barriers to achieving local greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. So many of us, and more of us as local governments, have our own greenhouse gas emissions goals. Durham's goes back to 2007, and then there have been a lot since then, and more of these renewable energy goals, as you saw on one of the previous slides. And so, because of course we are not a home rule state, there's only so much we can do as local governments to achieve these goals. And so there's a lot actually that we need to have happen at the state level. And these are just some examples. You can see building codes is a big one. We can't say in any of our local jurisdictions, we want you to build buildings that are more efficient, because that's a statewide thing. And so in order for us to have more efficient buildings, we need that to happen on a statewide level. You can read through these. I won't go through every single one of them, but some of these, the incentives for solar, I know was on a previous group's slide, just that the incentives aren't necessarily meeting the mark on what we're trying to incentivize, or they're not high enough, or maybe they're not targeting exactly the right thing. So re-looking at some of those incentives, including better net metering rates and incentives for battery storage. And then more options for retaining renewable energy credits. This is something if you have your own goal for 100% renewable and you put solar on top of your building and you sell that electricity to Duke, they get the RECs. And then do we get to take credit for that towards our renewable energy goals? That's a little tricky. I will add one bullet that's not on here is the transportation sector. We have been talking a lot about electricity and utilities, which is huge and important, but transportation is almost 50% of our emissions in a lot of our communities, certainly is in Durham. And of course, there's this hope, dream, maybe reality of electrification of transportation, and if we had clean renewable electricity and that was going into our vehicles, that would help a lot. But I don't think electrification is going to happen to everything all the time, and should it? We should have diversity in our fuel mixes as well. So just thinking a bit more about how to make that happen on a statewide level that's not completely reliant on electrification of our transportation system. Speaking the needs of a unique constituency, local governments are both large rate payers. We buy huge amounts of energy, and we also have community members who are the other parts of the rate base, and we also have expectations from those communities. And then creating an integrated strategies that focus on demand side and supply side, prioritizing where there'll be the biggest impact. So really looking at on both sides of those, the demand side as well as the supply side. And one of the questions that came up for us, the way the state did the inventory, pulling the electrical sector out and then still having categories for buildings, for commercial and residential, we thought that's different than the way we do things, and so it's a little bit difficult to compare what we're doing at the local level and how that feeds up into the statewide inventory. Motivating factors. The impacts of climate change are felt locally. When there's a flood, it's our people who respond first. It's our constituents that we need to find new housing for. It's our roads that are washed out. And so this is a huge motivating factor for us because it's us. It's here right now. And we bear a lot of those costs. Now, of course, if there's some major, huge storm Florence comes in and there's funding that comes in from the state and the federal government, that's wonderful, it's very appreciated. But when we're talking about there's still a cost to the local government to that, but also when we're talking about these things that don't rise to that level, but are still part of this climate change constantly, we pay that cost, we bear that cost, and also adaptation and resiliency, building that into our systems and our communities, we bear most of that cost as well. Striving to deliver on residents' expectations, we talked about that. We have a lot more constituents who are asking for these greenhouse gas reductions and renewable energy expectations. Local governments are leading by example, but it's not enough for us to meet the reductions that need to be made. In Durham, out of our whole inventory, only 2% of it is local government. So if the city, the school, and the county all stopped having any emissions tomorrow, it's still only 2% of Durham's greenhouse gas emissions. And like I said, we don't have a lot of ability to affect what's happening in the community. So that's a huge motivating factor for us to be in part of this conversation. And then we also believe that working together to align our goals and strategies will amplify the impact. So we truly believe in this process and in all the discussions of us all working together to find these solutions is going to be the way to do it. Vision for a clean energy future. I also am not going to read this. I'll just give you a second to read it yourself. It includes a lot of things in 2 sentences. We good? Yeah, okay. And then existing system challenges. The price for energy does not factor in the social and environmental costs of greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, we've heard that from some other groups and probably will continue to hear that. It really has to be built in there. Those externalities are the things that we and our residents get stuck paying for. The lack of consumer choice, and that was brought up by both of the previous presenters. Renewable energy procurement is expensive, complicated, and limited, which kind of goes back to that choice. Existing options for accessing clean energy are not equitable, and we heard some discussion about equity. It's a really important issue for the local governments as well. Lack of funding and finance options for energy and efficiency-related investments. And then lack of accounting for greenhouse gas impacts and investment funding decisions at the state level. So really, how can that get put into decisions that DOT makes or that some of the other executive functions make, putting that really in there in the baseline with everything else. And then the benefits. Reliability, we generally think that is good, of course, when we have more storms and things like that. These big things happen. We want to see the reliability continue to be a strong part of it. Affordable energy is kind of the flip side, because on my last slide I said we want to include the cost of carbon and greenhouse gases in the price we're paying. Right now, from the bill you pay, it might be affordable, and of course there are these larger costs that get paid by somebody at some point. And so really figuring that out in a way that's equitable to everybody, to the utilities and to the ratepayers and to the people who are living near the power plants, all of that is something that will take a lot of really smart people to figure out. Building codes, we actually think it's a good thing to have state level codes. So even though it might be frustrating that we can't control the codes in our own communities, we do think it's a good thing to have state codes, because if you can change the code, you can change it across the board. And that means the communities maybe who don't have staff to focus on this still can benefit from that, and that it can make a difference for everybody across the state. So we do think having state codes is good. However, we do think that needs to be tied with more aggressive adoption of amendments that will drive building energy performance. So adopting the most stringent energy codes that are available would be good across the board. And another benefit is that we have momentum in building a robust clean energy economy. It's been talked about before as well, and we have to create further opportunities for innovation. So we're in a good place to be innovating. Had some good conversation over here with some folks from academia about all the great research that's going on. We really have a lot in this state to draw from, and we need to take advantage of that more.
And as we did last time, we'll do a round of questions after the second presentation. So now we have Eric.
I'm Eric Shire from NC Interfaith Power and Light. I coordinate the energy program with them. And I'm here to talk about the Consumer Protection Group, which is a made-up name that covers those who identified as environmental justice and consumer advocacy groups respectively at the last meeting. And that's probably the first note, other than the obligatory non-endorsement clause that everybody has stated at this slide, that this is a combination of two groups, and I think it was even harder than normal to reach consensus. And so this is really just a window into an ongoing conversation, and hopefully we'll have more of it. If you're new to this process and you want to be part of this group and you weren't before, please let us know. I think there's probably some justification to give each of these groups the time they were slotted to originally, rather than just me talking for 15 minutes, but I won't talk for 30 minutes. So yeah, consumer protection is an umbrella for now to cover these perspectives. In terms of our priorities, we focused on clean, fair, and efficient throughout this presentation in terms of a way to summarize the perspectives. Cleanliness, we will talk about what exactly that means, but certainly incorporating the full life cycle of the energy system into our thinking and defining what goals we're trying to achieve. The conversation with nuclear is very relevant. But we need something out of this plan and this process that actually provides us a framework to get there. Nobody here wants to go in blind, but there's an understanding that we'll have to be adaptable and maybe change our goals as we go. Fairness and equity, those are synonyms, but they were separated as values early on in the process. And I think bringing those back together and reiterating that fairness is equity, and it's different than what you might expect when you think of fairness from when you're growing up with siblings or something like that. And that we really need to be focusing on the fairness of this process and the fairness of the outcoming system that we are planning. And then efficiency, we really need to maximize all the resources that we have, both at a micro level and a macro level. Everybody wants to make sure that we take the right steps in the right order throughout this process. We don't have much margin for error in what we're doing, and we have to do it relatively quickly. So being efficient is really key. In terms of fairness, I will just note some words that people wanted to associate with that word, which is just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive. So keep those in mind maybe when you're thinking about fairness. In terms of why we're here, I just alluded to a lot of this, but in terms of the clean aspect, the moral imperative of taking action when you see facts and have reason to take action is probably the primary driver behind this group. We're seeing impacts now in our state, and it's going to continue to destabilize communities economically, environmentally, and socially. So we have a moral obligation to act. We already have a moral obligation in our actions in terms of fairness that's embodied in the social contract. We have a regulatory construct. Safety is a thing that we continue to work to define. There's an inappropriateness of allowing low and moderate income communities to subsidize stranded assets. So we have to be careful what we're building now based on what we expect will happen. We have communities throughout the state who are experiencing disproportionate impacts from the life cycle of the energy system. So thinking about the fairness of the entire system is really important. And the urgency, again, is a driver for efficiency. This is a highly complex problem that we have a limited time to solve. So it's an optimization problem, and being efficient is part of solving any optimization problem. Yeah, there's a lot of examples we can talk about. So our vision, The only thing I'll emphasize here is that this is a very broad vision, and that there are some specific things here that are still kind of under discussion that we wanted to bring up. For instance, what type of competition should be involved in this vision in the energy system. So inevitably, because the energy system is a market, there's going to be competition of some sort, and defining exactly what that's going to be, how it's going to work, compared to the competition that we've had so far, and what our values are, is going to be important. It's something that really came up in this vision discussion. So real quickly, before we talk about things to fix and things to keep, I wanted to benchmark where we are on these values. We're going to talk about metrics later this afternoon, I hear, but I didn't know that, so I got a little bit ahead of myself. So just using some rough benchmarks for each of these values and trying to define clean as our group defined it, we use the EPA guidelines for green to be clean, because the EPA guidelines for clean say, pick a better term. And so that includes solar, wind, hydro, and biomass, but not coal, natural gas, or nuclear. I think there's definitely an understanding that existing nuclear assets and any future assets for which the life cycle can be carbon negative or neutral are probably on the table, but it's like a broader discussion, and I think thinking about the life cycle of clean is very important here. For fairness, the description there is actually a old version that should be corrected to be by county. So this indicates the where the average county's energy burden in North Carolina stacks up on the national scale. So we're in around the 16th percentile for energy expenditures as a percentage of income. And then for efficient, just using an ACEEE report card and getting that out of 100. I think we can all come up with better and different numbers for these, but just like to frame where we are from this group's definitions perspective. So when we talk about things to fix, like in general, we think we probably have more things to fix than we have to maintain, but there's some infrastructure that we need to maintain in order to fix the things we need to fix. So for things to fix, under clean, I mean the absence of strong definitions for clean, right? That's something we already are dealing with. And incorporating the full life cycle into that definition is very important. Price signals toward that definition are also very important, and they, allude to fairness and efficiency as well. For fairness, there are disproportionate impacts as it stands in the system, and if we don't take the right steps next, they're going to get worse, or at least stay the same, which is already bad. So really fundamentally looking into that and defining fairness is going to be really important. And then efficiency, we have a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of different options, but utilization is an issue, availability of financing, credit, things like that. And that also applies to generation too, just like being efficient in how we utilize distributed resources and people's ability to invest in their own, homes and vehicles and things like that towards this system will be important. In terms of things to keep, the reps is great that it exists. Having any standard is important. There's some improvement there, and there's other options for how to move that forward, but that's a good foundation. In terms of fairness, it's good that we have rates for efficiency. That's not a regulated category in most cases. So that the fact there's transparency there and that there's the ability for people to actually do things is important. Same with existing tax credits, rebates, net metering, compensating producers and consumers based on transparent metrics is an important part of being fair and letting them have a say in that process. And then in terms of efficiency, same thing actually in a way that it's possible to engage in energy efficiency contracts for performance. We now have leasing and third-party ownership that is effectively an exchange of energy rights, the REC, renewable energy credit system. Those market-based mechanisms are a very important aspect of efficiency. Yeah, and that's the conclusion that sums up what I just said, but I guess I forgot to mention that overall in FIX, we would say access is the theme there that, giving people access to the marketplace and letting them see transparently what the impacts of their actions will be and take action will be important while maintaining that to be a fair process. And then on things to keep moving forward, the market-based mechanisms, even in a regulated context, price signals are very important, and to make those transparent and give people an idea what they're doing is something to keep doing.
Thanks, Eric and Tobin. So as we did previously, we have a few minutes or a little bit of time for questions. I'd first like to invite if any members of the DEQ staff have questions for Tobin or Eric.
Well, my team, you can speak up. Don't worry about it. One quick question, and this may not be as relatable to you all at this point, but in the future. There's a term called just transition. As utilities of the present make changes for the power of the future, local municipalities and the communities are going to be most affected by that transition. So there's an effort with organizations to provide local governments assistance, and also to ensure that the job base and the trained workforces are ready for those jobs of the future. Can you say a few things about whether your team talked about that and what the thinking was?
We didn't talk explicitly about the job training part and the transition in this conversation, but we talk about it all the time. And it is something that is really that is really important. We see it as an opportunity for additional skill sets to be developed, and also because renewable energy can be more distributed, where instead of having gigantic, large power plants in some communities, that there's an opportunity to have those resources distributed in more communities and actually spread those jobs and opportunities out further. But we definitely don't want to gloss over the negative impact that can happen when there is a transition. There are going to be winners and losers, and to flatten that out and really do what is needed to make that not as stark of an impact on our communities and on individuals is really important.
Eric?
Yeah, I would just add that, so our vision is, the first 5 words, we envision a just transition. And the focus on fairness and equity within that, I would argue, is probably the most important conversation that we're having, and why we're here all together to start, because establishing that baseline of what that actually means, something that we might not be able to reverse once we've started down a road that we choose. So we're really thoughtful up front. Thanks for the question.
Bob Leaker with the DEQ. Tobin, I have a question for you. I'm also on the Wake County Energy Commission. We help staff interpret or move forward with the county commissioners' goal statements. I'm wondering how you understand how prepared you feel to implement aspirational goals that I see being promulgated, and what steps or what your thinking is about implementation plans.
Oh, we think a lot about that. And I'm going to also invite other local government folks in the room to speak up on this. But I'm going to say we don't feel really very prepared to do that. And again, it goes back to this concept of what we can control and what we can't control. And especially when those aspirational goals include the community as a whole, where we just really don't have a lot of tools to move those levers. I guess levers are tools, but you know what I mean? It's very challenging to think about how we're going to implement that. Even within our own organizations, it's challenging when there aren't a lot of options. So when we look at our fleet, for example, and our ability to just transition our entire fleet over to something renewable it doesn't even exist. Even if we wanted to, and even if we had the resources, there aren't even really vehicles that do all the things that we need to do that come in alternative ways of powering them. And it's not to say there's nothing we can do. There's a lot we can do, and we're focusing on those, but we're also really trying to dig in and see how are we going to do these really challenging goals. How are we going to achieve these goals? I don't know if any of my other local government people want to chime in on it.
You did a great job.
Thank you. It's hard.
Other questions?
I'm sorry, if I could just add one more thing though. But what we have been doing is talking a lot more. We've always talked and we've always kind of collaborated, but we've been very intentional about those of us who do have plans or who think plans are coming down the line soon to talk among each other and to share as much information as we can and see where there are opportunities for us, just like what's happening in this room, just like what happened with the city's initiative, to see where can we amplify our voices to get the changes or the market power that we need. There's a national organization that has created a collaborative for local governments to purchase electric vehicles, for example. So maybe we can do that collectively a little more effectively than we're each doing it ourselves.
Hello, Megan Anderson, City of Raleigh Sustainability Manager. I just wanted to follow up on what Tobin said about the options, because as we speak to a lot of the communities around North Carolina, big cities versus small cities versus counties, the options are really important because we're not one size fits all too. So we need a menu of options so we can all kind of figure out what works best for us, working within our own unique barriers and needs within our communities too, because there's a lot of differences and a lot of similarities. So I would just want to reiterate that a couple options probably aren't even enough that would work for everybody too. So the more the better for us to be able to do the things we need to do.
Leah, we have a question over here.
All right, let's go over here and then we'll come back over here. I see lots. Oh,
Got two right here.
all right. Actually, can I ask you to hold because I believe this gentleman was just ahead of you.
That is just fine.
Thank
As
you.
long as I get in front of
Although I
Steve,
might object to
I'm
the
good.
gentleman part of that.
Hey, I got a mic too. I'll continue to pick on Tobin. Jerry Williams with SAS. And could you expand on, I guess, your mention of constituents in terms of, I guess, influence or meeting expectations?
Yeah, so the people who are in our community, it used to be called citizens, and I think a lot of local governments are moving away from the term citizens for what reasons you can come up with. And so thinking about residents, people who live in our communities, is one part of that. But that also includes the businesses in our communities. It includes the institutions in our communities. These are all constituents to us. And they all have a voice, and they come to our meetings, and they speak, and they send letters, and they talk to us when they see us in the grocery store, all of those things. They're your constituents too, right? Because whoever lives in my community also lives in my county, and they're a customer of yours, and they live in the state, and they buy things from your company. So really, they're all the same. They're all the same, but of course, some areas have concentrations of different constituents that want different things, obviously. But does that clear that up?
Great. So now we'll go over here and then we'll come back over here.
Fair enough.
Reminder to reintroduce yourself.
Sure. Steve Callan with the Clean Tech Center at NC State. So, Tobin, you didn't use the same exact words that Eric did, but you both, I think, when you're talking about tools, you're talking about some of these issues of, you summed it up nicely in your last slide, Eric, transparency and access. And I go back to the previous panel, and we had that list of things that Michael had thrown up there of things that were working well. And I don't disagree that a lot of those things that were on that list have historically worked well, but they're not things that kind of lend themselves to the future of transparency and access, particularly in municipalities that don't have an electricities member. Could you guys talk a little bit more about things that you guys see in the current structure that might help to improve transparency and access that we could work on to try and relieve some of the regulatory burdens and allow the utilities to share more of that information and more of that access?
You want to answer that? Is that what you do?
No, I feel like you have a good.
Oh, you feel like? I'm just gonna play ping pong over here a little bit.
Well,
That's true. That's true. Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Rob. Yes. Data, 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 right? You can't manage what you don't measure, right? So just getting that information of what we use in our own organization is a large job that a lot of local governments don't even have staff to do, much less the capacity to do. We're super lucky to have a great partner who's here in the room, Daniel Kaufman, who's helped us a lot figure that out, but it has been hard. I know SAS does a lot of that work too, and they're working with the city. And so having easier access to that data, and I know there have been discussions on green button and things like that that have been happening in the state, is really important, because even if we can put all this work into understanding our own operations, again, that's just 2% of what's going on in all of our community, and I'm sure that's similar in most communities. When we try to create a residential energy efficiency program in our own community, but we don't have any way to measure what the impact of that is because we can't access that energy data, that makes it really hard to launch a program and to know if we're doing a good job with it and whether we should continue it and to get justification for funding it. So the access to data in a lot of different levels for our own operations as well as for the community is one very obvious barrier. I would say another one, when we think about the tax incentives, for example, or the rebates for renewable energy, and that you don't really know ahead of time if you're going to get that rebate because there's only this much of it and it's kind of a first come, first serve, but you have to be sort of this far along in your process before you can apply for it. That's a barrier right there. And it would be really great if there was a way to design that so that you had a little more assurance up front. If, like, where does it make sense to start even planning to do this? And those are some examples. Fellow local government people, yeah. Greg?
Greg Sponsler with the City of Raleigh. One of the themes that I was hearing from the conversations that we were having throughout the local government group were a lot of the different reporting requirements that local governments are asked about. So we have so many different organizations that are asking for the cities and municipalities to provide them information about the communities, and that's great. We love providing that. However, an opportunity that we see here, and I think this was from a lot of the other cities, are being able to define some of these different metrics in very meaningful ways. We have the renewable energy or clean definition that we have trouble, putting our finger on, and some of these other metrics. This is a great opportunity going through this process for us to align some of the goals, align our priorities, figure out what metrics are most meaningful throughout the state, and then get ourselves on a comparable sort of ground where we can see how we're working with each other throughout the state.
Yeah, I'll just add to that real quick. The only thing I didn't hear was just uniformity and translation of rate structures and price signals, like information coming to the customer across utility service territories and other sorts of programs would be really valuable on the other end.
All right. I think let's go here, Tara, and then we'll go over there. And then we have one. Okay. We'll do 3 more before we move on.
Great. Tim Perfetta with the Nicholas Institute at Duke University. Hello, everybody. I didn't realize I was at the local government table, but so I'm gonna trigger my question off of Tobin's presentation again. So apologies, Tobin, if you're and I'm trying not to make this a kind of a more controversial question, but trying to suss something out. I noticed there was a big gorilla on your slide in your recommendations that you didn't mention, which was the deregulation of the electricity market was in there. But that's a massive issue. I think we should probably surface it a little bit. And what I'd like you to do is talk a little bit about the rationale for putting that on the slide, and also whether it's to increase competition and consumer choice, whether there's also maybe full deregulation options that you're thinking about too, because there's a lot of different ways to get that in there. So I bet it was on there and it wasn't even mentioned, and I was like, how could we just blur right by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's those are again, going back to the fact that this is not, that those are ideas that were brought up in our discussions and that no particular governments have endorsed them or all of those other kinds of things. You know, deregulation is, it is kind of a gorilla. It's right there. It's a strategy that can be taken, but it certainly is not an easy strategy, and it's not one that doesn't come with consequences to it. And so it's, I think it does go back to the idea of having more choices and having competition to be able to choose that if we're not getting what we want from the utility that serves us, that we as a local government or as a community could go somewhere else and get that. And that would provide some incentive for utilities to be providing things that constituents want. Is the big picture there.
Eric,
Any
do you want
other
to say something?
thoughts on that? Yeah.
Eric.
So we didn't explicitly say that in our presentation, but we said it in every other way in that presentation. So, but I think it's very interesting. There's a few points of contention, which are why we didn't say it explicitly, which are that one is that RMI is here, so I'll say negawatts are megawatts, and in current, the current programs, that's treated as such. But then if you go the other way and you start to generate, it's not treated the opposite way. So there's some inconsistency there that needs to be worked out. And people who are very wary of competition as consumer groups are actually very comfortable in the efficiency space, weirdly. But people who are wanting competition are less comfortable there, which is kind of, I don't know, just says something about the transparency, I think, and market access. And then more broadly, what we focus on is the level playing field for all megawatts, basically all capacity or energy. And I think it's impossible to find a place that's completely deregulated, so it's kind of strong man. And so where we fall on that spectrum and get to the goals we want by creating like competitive spaces, whatever you call that, is more.
Great. Thanks, Eric. So we'll go over here, and then you will have the last question, sir. Yeah, Paula.
Hi, Paula Hemmer with DEQ. Whenever we talk about storms or droughts or fires, we always talk about this one incident and the dollars it costs. Do you guys ever try to annualize that in any kind of way as counties or municipalities? Or is it just this one event type of, and are you tracking it in any way?
Not that I know of, so I can't say that there's nobody out there doing that. But it comes in such little bits, that we have flooding in this one area a couple times, and there's some businesses that are affected, and then the next week there's that. Of course, when we're talking about droughts and things like that that are major, that affect our entire water system, and we have a whole department that handles that, yes, they're measuring that. But when you're talking about the little things that are happening here and here, when we have a week that's above 90 degrees and doesn't get below, 90 degrees at nighttime, and there are people who are going to the emergency room because of that, no, we're not. We can't be tracking all of these little impacts of climate. Unfortunately, I'm sure that there are people who are tracking little bits of it as it is part of their wheelhouse. We did just work recently regionally on our Triangle Regional Resilience Assessment, and we went through what are the impacts that we are seeing and that we're likely to see more of, and what are the things that are most vulnerable to that, and that's the first step. And then looking at priorities for increasing that resilience, and those things will often come with a price tag, so there will be some sense of what helping those things might cost. But as far as all the little everyday things, I wouldn't say so.
All right. Did you want to say anything, Eric? All right.
Maybe some academic in here wants to step up and do it. That'd be awesome.
You do have a room full of a lot of universities.
Yeah,
so.
I know. It's a great idea.
Over here.
Looking at you, Jen.
Thumbs,
It's happy to handle that
thumbs.
stuff. Rory McElmoyle, Appalachian Voices. I was applauding inside my heart when you were talking about the regulatory question. I think we could dedicate a whole day just on that one question. I think it's really important. But Eric, I greatly appreciate your focus on equity and fairness and energy burden. And I was just wondering if you had any specific proposals as to how the clean energy plan process, but also goals, system-wide goals. If you have any recommendations as for how we address those serious issues in North Carolina moving forward.
That's the next step. I would say, like, we're going to talk about metrics later, so I think that's probably an opportunity to really get into the details on that. You know, what are we actually trying to get here? Energy burden is relative to some other metrics pretty early in its development, and there's some room to determine what exactly fairness means in terms of the energy system. So, and then also comparing that to how fairness has historically been defined and seeing what needs to be changed is probably an opportunity to build on some prior work. Yeah, I mean, to zoom out a lot, I think of it a lot as if we were building Facebook or Google in a regulated environment. What decisions would we make? Like, just start to think about that thought example, and you can start to think about all the analogies to the system that we're kind of building from scratch because it's really a product on top of an existing platform that has to be fair.